let me kind of close this section before we look forward with one other question. If we look at the issues that really have transcended the last half century of public life in Delaware, we've agreed that race certainly has been a significant issue, and various aspects of it, from desegregation on one hand to race in education and so on. What role do you think the press has played in a significant way in terms of helping shape the aspects of change with regard to race? And recognizing, in fact, that in Delaware, historically, and I was reading some stuff recently from President Lincoln's time, that we've had two different communities with regard to their view of race, upstate and downstate, with regard to their fundamental value systems that have shaped Delaware public life.
I think that the media has played a role, both good and bad. I think that there have been times when the media, and I say all media, have inadvertently and unintentionally, I believe, helped to perpetuate stereotypes. I think that the media, because of the way we define news, and I would kind of go back to Alan's comment a minute ago about these unobtainable women. Well, there are a lot of unobtainable people who aren't interested in news, and is that their fault or is that our fault? In terms of defining, if you look at, what are we here for? We're here to find out what it is people need to know. And historically, in a largely male-dominated and largely white male-dominated media, news has been defined by conflict and controversy and government and politics and all of these very holy things that are discussions about power and influence. And I think that those are all valid definitions of a certain strata of news. But I think when you get into the racial issues for a minute, there's always a lot of coverage of tension and of crisis. I don't know, though, that we have yet defined news as an ongoing discussion, as an ongoing dialogue. I think we're getting better at it, and I think that comments you made earlier, John, about how maybe some of these legendary voices that kind of came out and took strong opinions have given way to public journalism and civic journalism is maybe the beginning of that to some extent. But I think and you want to talk about this issue, you have to look back at the media. And if you want to talk about racial issues and diversity, I think, to be a little bit provocative, I think the media could do a better job being diverse in its own backyard. And because as you bring more women in, as you bring more people of color in, you get that input of what's important to those unobtainable women or those unattainable African Americans.
On the issue of race, I think it's interesting that the person who probably back in the early 50s, at the time of deseg, when Brian Bowles, the classic outside agitator, came to Delaware to stir things up in Milford, and until Senator Williams kind of challenged him, and Williams was reluctant in his challenge, but he did it. But it was Joe Pine, of all people, this bombastic kind of yelling and screaming radio talk show host, who got Bowles on his program up in Wilmington and challenged him in all of his racist issues. It was kind of interesting, and I remember that. I think Tammy's right. The press has portrayed the race issue both well and poorly, and it's been kind of an up and down thing. The stereotypes, and I think that there's a recognition on part of all of us in the media that has to end. And I think it largely has ended. I mean, people are now paying attention. You stop and think before you run this story or that picture about what message are you sending. And it doesn't mean you're censoring things or filtering things. You are filtering. You ought to filter. That's what a good newspaper does do that, or a good radio station. But you wonder about the impact of what you're going to print is going to have. But
it's funny, John, how we're still self-conscious about it. Somebody commented to me on the News Journal's sports page on Sunday, which was the annual basketball game between Delaware and Del State. And it was interesting, given the historical heritage of both these universities, the photo the News Journal ran, and people wondered if it was on purpose, was a African-American University of Delaware player and a white Del State player. So it was just a fascinating juxtaposition. And one person said to me, I wonder if they did that on purpose. So it's...
Yeah.
Alan?
3 factoids. Three factoids to challenge you. Factoid number one is actually younger African Americans come to news radio in greater numbers than young white Americans, especially on the female side. We know that that's all around the country. The young, affluent white female is least available of any subgroup in America. That's true not only in Wilmington, but all around the country. I can speculate as to reasons why. Number two, little factoid is I've been lecturing, visiting college campuses and high school campuses ever since I got out of college in '77, and I noticed an increased level of racial and ethnic and gender diversity in journalism classrooms, but may I suggest my impression is it hit a peak and it's going down again. And one of the factors may be a lot of kids have found out, the best and the brightest, that there are other ways to make a buck that are a lot more lucrative than journalism. I fear that's the problem.
They follow the walls.
Yeah, and we also see a lot of that in radio. There really is a digression, and it is very disturbing. And the final thing I would tell you in terms of talk radio, clearly, race along with morality, things like that, those are powerful topics. You get lots of calls. My impression as a programmer, though, is like abortion, if you're not careful, it can become the race show, and then all of a sudden you've just blown away half your listeners or viewers or readers. Now that begs the question, of course, should we worry about that if it's an important issue? But there is that danger of racial fatigue, just as there is fatigue on those other hot issues.
Let me close, if I might, by kind of asking a looking forward question. As I contemplated this question, I looked at our panel here, and we've got one seasoned radio guy, we've got a newspaper publisher who has dailies and weeklies, and we have the chief of the editorial operation of a statewide newspaper. We really have, on one hand, no one who is specifically has a cyber news gathering responsibility, and I'm sure if we did this panel in 10 years, and probably even 5 years, we'd have someone on this panel who did this. On the other hand, the News Journal has a cyber news operation of a kind. Certainly the independent newspapers does with its news app operation. When you look down the road over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you see coming with the impact of cyber news, both on daily newspapers? What kinds of changes do you see happening with daily papers, weekly papers, and broadcast? And we'll just kind of use this as a summing up.
I think it's a really exciting time to be in this business because it's a very challenging time. And I think that we talked earlier about kind of old ideas and opinions and maybe even organizational structures giving way to new ones. And I think that's just coming. That's being forced on the media. I think that the result is going to be very interesting. Again, I don't know that it's going to be either or. I think that the internet, my own opinion is that the internet and the various forms of media, TV, radio, and print, ink on paper, are going to exist and coexist for many years to come. But I think that the challenge that we face with the internet is that, and I think, John, you mentioned it earlier, everybody can be in the publishing business. And I think that's kind of good in a way. I think that it's going to be a very interesting experiment in democracy. On the other hand, I think that, and it has been an interesting experiment in democracy when you look at how people in Eastern Europe have used the internet to get the news out sometimes to the rest of the world. I think that our challenge and our role is going to be to really define or redefine ourselves. What do we want to be? And probably as people, remember we talked about that competition for time. So as people are just inundated with information. I mean, my God, you can't get away from it. Maybe they're not listening to talk radio, but you can't get away from information. And I think people feel almost desperate to try to make sense of it all. There's just so much on the internet. You can go to 50 bazillion sites. You don't know the quality of the information when you get there. It might be what you're looking for, it might not. And you're pressed for time, and you just get all this stuff coming at you. So however we end up, whatever format we end up using, I think that the role that journalism and that media can play, whether it's niche or whether it's mass, is in defining ourselves as people who, or as institutions that can gather information, be gatekeepers to some extent, and kind of put it into context and say, well, we're still here as a voice that can tell you what we think you might want to know about your community or about this particular aspect of your community, and help to make sense out of things. And I don't know that we'll always be doing it the same way we're doing it now, or in the same numbers.
I think that John Curley, who is the chairman of the Gannett Company, used to be publisher at the News Journal a while back. We were talking one day about where he saw things going, and unlike a lot of his fellow top Gannett corporate officers, he's not as worried about the challenges. He said, well, what we do, what Gannett does, what a lot of other companies do, what independent news does, is we know how to gather and organize information. And he said, whether we do it in the print, or we do it on broadcast, or we do it on the internet, our skill is a skill that the internet providing people don't have. They don't know how to gather and organize information. We do. So there'll be marriages or partnerships. I think that it will go one step beyond, and Tammy started to touch on this. I think that the role of interpreter, if you will, is going to grow. I think people are going to look to the news gathering institutions to be their guide through this massive information, much more so than now. We guide you now by the choices we make, but those choices are severely limited by space or time. What the internet does is it says space and time don't matter. So the amount of information coming at you it already has, and it's going to get worse more and more. And I think that the wise news corporations are going to figure out how to become better guides, how to say to you, here's what we think is important, and it'll be a lot more interactive. You'll ask us to guide you in this way or that way, and the successful media companies will know how to do that.
Alan?
I think it's fascinating that even before Fox News canned Matt Drudge over a highly emotional issue, the hits on the Matt Drudge website were way down. I think that suggests something that is somewhat encouraging and somewhat discouraging, and that is the media that have mastheads, that have institutional clout and have a reputation are going to be the ones that prevail in terms of macro versus micro on websites. In some respects, because that then means screening and double checking and reliability, that part of me says it's good. The part of me that says it's bad, though, suggests, well, we'll end up with a concentration of media on the web as we have in print and broadcast, and that part can be possibly bad. I have one little story to tell, which I think will amplify, though, how radio, TV, and print are all coming together through the internet. A friend of mine who worked in radio news all his life, in fact, we were together on college on the air, and he was working for a cool jazz station in Chicago. He got canned when they decided that even 90.5 seconds of news per hour was too much. He ends up next as the editor of the website at the Chicago Tribune, and he's telling me, Loudell, this is like radio. We're putting pictures here. We're doing audio. You got to do this. You got to become a future. Are you making any money? Well, I'm not sure yet, but this is the future. And I mean, that's the point. It's all coming together, but it's the prestige of the Chicago Tribune product in the Chicago market. It isn't an independent entrepreneur. I think there are going to be many opportunities for entrepreneurs, but I also think that as we have all these bits of information coming at us, the prestige and the reliability of the medium is very, very important. And that is why, as I may close this paragraph, I see suddenly the media, after we were publishing rumors and reporting on what the tabloids were doing even before we were able to confirm, I think we're pulling back a little bit from that now for the precise reason that the only way that we prevail in the new media age is that we be reliable and that we be authoritative, that our masthead or our logo does mean something.
If I can bring it to a close, I had the occasion a few weeks ago to hear a futurist named Gary Hamel speak. And he talked about, on one hand, how the internet increasingly will be the fundamental source for information as people shop, not necessarily of opinion, although there'll be those, the Matt Drudges of the world, but that if I were looking, I would say that we're going to see an integrated media. We're going to see something that, to the competency that John talked about of Gannett or of other newspapers of gathering and organizing and presenting the news, and you're still going to have room because the barriers to entry in an economic sense are so low. It's very easy for someone to start a website and create something. So the barriers to entry are so low, but the credibility and the momentum that the news gathering organizations have, as long as they continue to exercise that prudently, will do well. On behalf of Independent Newspapers, Inc., on behalf of the State of Delaware Division of the Archives, on behalf of Wesley College, I would like to thank three good friends, Tammy Brittingham, Alan Loudell, and my old colleague John Taylor for a very, very enlightening, interesting, provocative panel. It's been our pleasure to have you here this afternoon. And if you would, please feel free to reward this panel with a round of applause. Thank you very much.